Matthew chapter 23 and in verses 1 through 3 is a very important section in the scriptures where there is still much misunderstanding, even to this day, not just within mainstream Christianity, but even within Messianic Judaism. And a lot of this has to do with translating these words that are 2,000 plus years old. And it's been confirmed that the book of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, some say Aramaic, but definitely not Greek. And there's a 2nd century translator going into the Greek that admits this, and I can provide that with you on the comments of this video teaching later. I didn't put it in my notes. There's also more information I'll provide later in this video teaching. But before I do, let me quote the scripture for you. Matthew, we say Matisyahu, chapter 23, verses 1 through 3. In most of our English translations out there, which is why this causes some misunderstanding and some confusion. There's some ambiguous interpretation of this, we must admit, as we dive into it more deeply from the original languages here. It says in this verse, "Then Yeshua, aka Jesus, Yehoshua, spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples." Verse 2, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever," that's what it says here, whatever, keyword, "they tell you to do, to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do." So it sounds like it's just talking about their hypocrisy. Do everything they say and teach, because they sit in Moses' seat, but don't do as they do. And what I'm going to show, this is not just talking about hypocrisy. And we'll look into the context as well. It's more than just that. If we just take a shallow look from the English only and the Peshat level, the simple text only, it's very easy to be deceived on this scripture here. So before I dive into the depths of this, if the English translations, most of them, as I just quoted, the New King James, if they are correct, then what that does is it means that we must obey Pharisaic law, the oral Torah, halakha, to its completeness, is the logical conclusion. When he says whatever they say and teach, they're sitting in Moses' seat, so they have been given authority. The Sanhedrin and the writers of the Talmud, long after that, the Sanhedrin and the destruction of the temple. The Talmud was written a couple centuries after, and you can look at that through the Mishnah, and then going into the 2 Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, written by 2 different sects of 2 different regions, I say, by the Pharisaic successors of the Judaism of that time. So also we need to also realize that not only should we obey halakha, the Pharisaic law, the oral law, but this does seriously contradict Yeshua, some of his teachings, rebuking their priorities of the oral laws in comparison to the written law, or we say the Mosaic law. In Christianity also refers to it as the Mosaic law, or we say God's law, his law, the written one. And so this is, and I'm not trying to say that Yeshua rebuked all of it. I'm not saying that he didn't follow some of it, but I'm just talking about rebuking the priorities of it being equal or higher in authority and interpreting Moses, or claiming that it came down directly from Moses, from generation to generation, as the claim is. So now in verses, for example, this is not only in Matthew 15 and Matthew chapter 23. If you continue reading that, we need to look at the context, and also Mark chapter 7 and other scriptures. But I'm just going to go to one section here in Matthew chapter 15 where it seems like a complete contradiction here. Obviously, clear contradiction based on the English translations only. Here it says, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Then the scribes and Pharisees who were in Jerusalem," came to Yeshua. Now, if these were just some offbeat, lower-level Pharisees that were off base here, I think the Sanhedrin would have come down and said, "Hey, guys, this Yeshua guy is right, and you guys need to lighten up on him a little bit." And we don't see anything like that. The indication from Jerusalem is that this was Pharisees, some of them within the Sanhedrin itself, high-ranking ones. Jerusalem, that's a key word that was inspired to be put into here, said to Yeshua, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the traditions?" This is tachanot. If you know Judaism and Hebrew, tachanot, it's the traditions of, and this is what it says here in the actual text, of the elders. Who were the elders of Judaism? Say even the Talmud, written later on. You can just Google search tradition of the elders, and that is a phrase referring to oral law. We could say halakha. We could say Jewish, Pharisaic Jewish law. It's not talking about the Sadducean doctrines, of course. So he's talking to, these Pharisees are saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." And as I think in Mark it says, in a certain way. There's a certain way to wash hands. And this isn't saying it's wrong to be sanitary, to wash your hands before you eat, as we say. But it's more of a traditional way according to oral law here. And so Yeshua, aka Jesus, Yehoshua, says here in verse 3, "And he answered and said to them, Why do you also transgress," what does he say here? "The commandment of the Almighty," here, "because of your tachanots," your traditions. So again, he's not saying the whole thing is bad here, but look, the emphasis is priorities of what is right, and judging others based upon interpretations of Moshe or Moses, and elevating these traditions or oral law above the written ones. And he goes on to emphasize this. If you read verse 5 in Matthew 15, he says, "Thus you have made the commandment of the holy name," here, the Almighty, "of no effect by your tachanots," your tradition. Now these are enactments. These are legislation of new laws, of course, if we understand it to its completeness of the definition of the word here, of tachanots, also traditions of the elders, teaching as the doctrines, the commandments of who? It says men, not him, but men. Very clear here. It sounds like he's contradicting Matthew chapter 23, verse 3 here. Now notice this. Is this just a minority of Pharisees that he's putting down? I'm not saying all Pharisees were bad. A lot of them accepted him as the Moshiach. Nicodemus, a Pharisee. Joseph of Arimathea, who dealt with his body after the crucifixion. We see a lot of Pharisees I'm not saying they were all bad, but some of the Messianic Jewish claims here is that, oh, well, he only put down a very small group of the Pharisees, that most of them were the righteous ones, the holy ones. Well, notice verse 12 here in Matthew chapter 15. It says, then his disciples came to him, to Yeshua, and said, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? I don't think it was a surprise to Yeshua, and I don't think he was trying to be very diplomatic about it either. But we have to look at, are there serious contradictions? Like I said, read the rest of Matisyahu chapter 23. Go to Mark chapter 7. Read that very carefully, of a similar account of Matthew chapter 15. Some interesting differences in wording, which when you put together brings out more completeness and unity of what I'm saying here. Now, getting back to expounding on the detail, as I mentioned earlier, of this verse in Matthew, Matisyahu 23:3. Let's start diving into these words here, key words. Now it says, therefore, whatever they. Now, what we're going to see here, this word they is ambiguous. It should be translated whatever he tells you to observe, referring to he, and whatever they say according to him, according to Moses, Moshe. So to unify all this together, we'll see that Yeshua is saying whatever, they sit in Moses' seat, and whatever he says, Moses, whatever they're teaching you according to Moses is the accurate understanding here. It's hard to go into Greek and to English with this, but I'm going to show you it is a little ambiguous here, and so we have to choose how we're going to interpret it in unity or in division, to be, contradictory, or in unity with the context of the scriptures, the whole word here. Let's go to it. It says, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. And what I propose, he's saying that he's supporting Moses, what the Almighty, what Hashem told him to write down. It wasn't just Moses' words here. It was given him word for word, mouth to mouth, face to face, unlike any of the prophets or the Pharisees for that matter. Here, Moshe was different, and the prophet like unto Moshe, we see in Acts, the book of Acts, 2 times, that is Yeshua. In a sense, we have 2 lawgivers in the scriptures that are to be writing down laws, that have the authority to write down laws. And the prophets, the apostles, they only supported these 2 great prophets. And of course, Yeshua being more than just a prophet, of course. I'm not saying he was just a prophet. Please don't get me wrong there. He is Moshiach, Messiah, the Son of the living Yah here. So, but getting back to this, it says, that observe and do, Matthew 23:3, but do not do according to their works. Now, we're going to look at this from the Hebrew, and it's referring to the tachanot and ma'asim. Here, do not do according to their works, for they say and they do not do. Verse 4, key in context here, for they bind heavy burdens, heavy ones. Now, is Moses' commandments heavy burdens? Yeah, this is what Christianity tries to propose. The yoke of bondage is the Mosaic law. But what I propose here in verse 4, that Yeshua is talking about, that this fence around the law, this oral law, has been heavy burdens. He's saying hard to bear, and lay on them, on men's shoulders. Now again, this isn't the written Torah here. I don't believe it is. In John the apostle of love, 1 John 5:3 says, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, his, not man's, his, and they are not burdensome. Now, if you're a believer in the New Testament, we can't say that 1 verse 4 here is talking about the commandments of God as written down already in the books of Moses here. So getting on to this, and I'm not saying, we can't just cherry pick Moses' commandments, what we want to, get rid of and what we want to. We have to find credible evidence, as I said, not just hearsay, not just circumstantial evidence or doctrinal similarity evidence, but let's look at true, hard evidence here. And I'm going to get to that as we go. If you're not offended, please, if you are, please listen anyway. Please be patient with me. We can debate or dialogue on the comments of this video teaching, as long as there's no derogatory terminology or name calling or put down. Let's be scholarly. Let's be respectful and agree to differ if we need to. But let's look at some hard evidence here. It says, continuing in verse 4 of Matthew chapter 23, but they, referring to the Pharisees themselves, will not move them with one of their fingers. So at that time, it appears here that, that they were just, putting heavy burdens that they weren't even fulfilling to their standards. For example, the Sabbath, they would take an ox out of the ditch, but then they would put Yeshua down for helping somebody on the Sabbath or healing somebody just by praying. And Hashem, the power of the Spirit, does the healing. What's wrong with praying? I'm not talking about the job and occupation of a physician getting paid for doing a job on the Sabbath. I'm talking about just healing with the Almighty's help here. And so we can see that there was some hypocrisy in how they would even teach the commandments from Moshe, their interpretations of it, and yet even they themselves would take an ox out of the ditch and save a life, even on the Sabbath. And even mainstream Judaism today says it's okay to save a life on the Sabbath and do a lot of work, to whatever work it takes to save life. So there's been a lot of improvement in that regard over the last 2,000 years. But moving on here, what does this actually mean in Matthew chapter 23:3 if it's translated inaccurately as I propose in this video teaching, with some good evidence as well? Well, if you haven't already, I recommend a YouTube free video teaching. It's very long and extensive, 2 hours. It's titled "The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus," and it's Nehemiah Gordon. And some people have a problem with him because he's a Karaite and have this bitterness and prejudice against Karaites. But what I appreciate about him, he says, I don't accept Yeshua as Messiah when he did this video teaching quite a few years ago. He's a Hebrew, non-biased Hebrew scholar evaluating this book, this Shem Tov version, this Hebrew version of Matthew, and he provides a lot of evidence to show that this book had to have been first written in Hebrew, and then as you get into Greek and English, there's some lost information, as you do when you go from any language to another. Even software engineers out there know you go from one language to another. Even in software engineering, there's some lost information. And there's some loss of power and emotion, too, when you go from one language to another. So, since this video teaching is so long, if you want the section just on this section of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 1 through 3, go to 1 hour, 15 minutes, and 50 seconds. It's 1 hour, 15 minutes, and 50 seconds here. And go up to 1 hour, 29 minutes, and 35 seconds. So it's only about 14 minutes if you want the real meat. And he's got a PowerPoint presentation, a lot better than high-tech than what I can propose here. I'm not a high-tech guy. I can't insert, so far I don't know how to insert even scriptures and pictures into my video teachings yet. Maybe later on along that he'll provide. But for right now, I just got to teach and shoot from the hip, so to speak, here. But go to that and watch that from a non-biased, like I said, famous Hebrew scholar, and to show how it can be translated in unity on a scholarly level. And look at those Hebrew words. And so what I'm going to go to that is he goes to the Shem Tov version. It's also, you can look it up yourself. It's the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. I got the paperback version here by George Howard. And so this is a very good to look at this. And if you go to page 113, 112, 113, you see this section on Matthew chapter 23 verse 3 here. And even this, again, don't just rely on the English side only. If you do, yes, he puts they in there instead of he. And what Nehemiah Gordon points out is that this word can be translated as he. And I'm going to just quote some comment from someone who gave me some comments on this on Facebook. And from what they said, that George Howard adds they instead of he in the he puts it in the parentheses here. However, if you know, he says here, if you pay attention to the footnotes, there are 9 texts in Shem Tov Matthew. 6 of them have the they. Therefore, 3 of them have the he. Instead of the he, they have the they in 6 of them. And he lists the text as found on page, you look on page 7, I believe, and one being in the text he uses up through Matthew 23:22, and then the 8 texts, 6 of which say they say instead of he says. So the majority, proposed here is they, not he, but 3 of them have he. So people just say the majority's got to be right. I'm not always convinced by the majority. Sometimes the majority's right. A lot of times we see even in Scripture the majority is wrong. So we have to admit there's some ambiguousness to this. Now, the word for they or he, as you'll see in the Scriptures, is the yud, the aleph, the mem, and the resh. And there's a suffix, the vav, the suffix, and you can just Google search, do a little Google search on vav, V-A-V, suffix meaning. Suffix is the tail end of the word. And remember, if you don't know Hebrew very well, Hebrew goes in the opposite direction as English in most languages. It goes from the left to the right, where English goes from the right to the left. And did I reverse that? But English goes from the left to the right, and Hebrew goes. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. Let me rephrase that one more time. I'm trying to reverse it with my hands here, and that's confusing me. So English goes from left to right, and Hebrew you read from right to left. Okay, won't get my hand involved there to confuse me. But I know the difference, and sometimes I get a little dyslexic. So I think we're all imperfect here. But the vav, the suffix, would be on the far left of the word here. The vav, now in ancient Hebrew, like I said, if you Google search this, you'll probably find out that if you put a little dot above the vav, it's singular. And that's a vowel. That would be O. If you put the dot to the side of the vav, to the left of the vav on the suffix, it's U, and that would be a plural, according to my research on that. I don't claim to be an expert in ancient Hebrew as much as like Nehemiah Gordon and others who... And Nehemiah Gordon grew up as a Pharisee, in a Pharisee home, Orthodox home. He later became a Sadducee because of his dislike and lack of unity that he found in the oral law. So he knows Pharisaic law and idioms as well as anyone, and as well as Hebrew, learning that from childhood growing up. So he's a much more credible Hebrew scholar than I claim to be, I admit, I confess. But the simplicity of this you can research, like I said, if you Google search Vav suffix meaning, and you'll see that the plural as a verb identifies the subject of the verb as masculine plural here, if it's a verb. And so that would be pronounced something to the effect of amru, or they said. Now, if you put, and that's without the yud at the beginning of the word, you put the yud at the beginning, it would be yimru, which means they will say. So the grammar can change even just by the prefix as well, the beginning of the word. And so if we put a tav at it, it would be timru, meaning you will say. So we can see here how it is important to know, and this is as a verb. Now as a noun, this word, this Hebrew word, yado, becomes a third person masculine singular possessive pronoun. Ooh, highfalutin phrase there. Third person masculine singular possessive pronoun. And for example, a different Hebrew word here would be the yud, the dalet, and the vav at the end would be yado. If it would be referring to singular, it would be his hand. So it would be singular his, not he. So we can see here that the suffixes and the prefixes are important. And 2,000 years ago, let me just state that 2,000 years ago they didn't have the vowels. I think we all know that. Most people do, and in case you don't. So whether the dot was above the vav or to the side of the vav wasn't there 2,000 years ago. And this is why we find differences in interpretation. And most of the translators have taken the majority view, even though it's ambiguous, and don't realize how their interpretation is contradicting, causing Yeshua to contradict himself quite seriously if we don't take it to its logical conclusion here. So I'll just give you, I've highlighted some of these words in Shem Tov here. In verse 3, you see going down a few words here, it says, now which they say. Now that Hebrew word doesn't have the vav at all. There's no vav in it. Look at on this side over here on the Hebrew side, it's just the yud, the aleph, the mem, and the resh. No vav. Wow. So, it could be translated as he, also referring in the yud, beginning of it, sure seems to imply more singularity as a noun or as a pronoun. Third person, singular possessive. Third person singular, not plural, okay? And in context. So we can look at this, and like I said, go to Nehemiah Gordon's video teaching titled The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus, and go to that section, like I said, 1 hour, 15 minutes, and 50 seconds, and go all the way to 1 hour and 29 and a half minutes there. And so we can see there's a minority use of that word as singular and a majority use of it, apparently, in used as a plural. So we need to look at what are the actual words here and see how difficult this is. In Nehemiah Gordon, if you listen to the whole video teaching, I think most people are convinced that the book of Matthew, and he provides some scholarly historical information, also Shem Tov during the Spanish Inquisition time period, who preserved the Hebrew Matthew, and it was found in Orthodox Jewish archives in Moscow when the Soviet Union broke apart, and it was found in Hitler's museum for the Jews he titled The Extinct Race. Why is this Shem Tov version found in Jewish Orthodox archives? And we need to understand that they studied these scriptures of Matthew, especially during the Spanish Inquisition when there were the big debates And the Catholics were bringing them into debate about this whole Messiah issue, and they would study the New Testament just to win these debates, only to be tortured or murdered afterwards in many cases, unfortunately. But regardless of all that, I don't want to get off on tangent, but we need to look at the actual words, see the ambiguousness of it, and see what unifies, what brings it to unity rather than division or divisive. What unifies the entire word? What interpretations cause serious, obvious, clear contradictions? So at the end of the day, we have two choices in regard to this interpretation. And like I said, even in Matthew, when it says don't do according to their works, in the Shem Tov, it doesn't say works or just actions or deeds. It's talking about it says tachanotes, traditions, and ma'asim. This is Jewish legislation of adding laws here. So Shem Tov, we see the context is more unity, where Yeshua is saying he's actually talking about their halakha not being perfect. And like I said, I'm not insulting culture or tradition, and if you really want to follow those strict laws, I'm not trying to rebuke you, but what I'm trying to say is let's unify the scriptures. We've got two choices. Are we going to interpret these scriptures, which are going to bring contradictions, or unity in His Word?